Welcome to the Dignity Negotiation, a podcast series from the Dignity Accord, exploring how systems shape human dignity, identity, and the condition under which people are recognized, judged, and understood. This is the episode 2 of season 2, Dignity in Identity. In our opening episode, The Right to Be Seen, we explored a simple but profound question. Who decides how we are seen? We argued that identity is never formed in isolation. Long before people describe themselves, they are already being interpreted through families, cultures, institutions, and societies that shape what becomes recognizable, acceptable, or legitimate. Today's conversation continues that inquiry by turning to one of the forces that quietly shapes those judgments: shame. Most conversations treat shame as something deeply personal, an emotion experienced by individuals. Yet, shame also moves through relationships, institutions, communities, and public life. It shapes who is believed, who is doubted, who is welcomed, who remains defined by a single moment, and who is quietly allowed to move on. When harm occurs, our first instinct is often to ask who is responsible. That question matters. But what happens if we stop there? Can accountability coexist with curiosity? Not everyone bears the consequence of judgment equally. Some people carry its weight for years. Others recover quickly. Some institutions reinforce it, while others remain largely untouched by it. That is the inquiry at the heart of today's episode. To help us explore it, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kenneth Logan, the professor of clinical psychology at George Fox University. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. Logan has worked at the intersection of trauma, psychology, moral injury, and human meaning, helping individuals navigate some of life's most difficult experiences while exploring what makes healing, responsibility, and repair possible. Dr. Logan, welcome to the Dignity Negotiation.
Hi, Phils. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'd like to begin with the foundation. Shame is one of the experiences almost everyone recognizes, yet defining it is much harder than it first appears. From your perspective, what is shame and how does it actually differ from guilt, and why does that distinction matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, Phils, I'm thinking about the topic title that you sent to me in terms of the shame economy. I think you had mentioned. And to me, that talks a lot about how shame circulates between people and it distributes itself in community and in our groups, and it rarely stays contained to the person who's being judged. And shame being differentiated from guilt. Guilt is feeling bad for perhaps something we've done, but the focus is on behavior. and regret and that sort of thing. Shame kind of goes beyond that, and it starts to address the person. So if I feel ashamed, it's not that I did something wrong, it's that there's something wrong with me. It's more personalized. And so with shame being experienced, I think once shame enters a relationship or a community or whatever, everyone's pressured, for example, to take a position towards judgment, and that starts affecting everybody in the economy. So someone may gain status from it. Some may gain a sense of belonging. Some folks increase a sense of moral credibility as they respond to another person's shame reaction, or even relief from their own anxiety about things by locating shame in somebody else. So so it's not just my response to it, but it's also my community's response to me as I've done something that is evoking a conscience kind of reaction. So one person's moral elevation can be purchased through another person's humiliation. So it starts to differentiate people. I start to feel better about myself as I look at other people's failures or failings. If I'm the one who's caused the problem, if I diminish myself, then I tend to idealize other people, and I stop seeing them as being human too. I see them maybe being better than me or more proper than me or whatever. But so shame's not just only an emotion that exists inside of us. It also becomes kind of a social currency, if you would. Families and organizations and religious communities, political groups, online cultures can use shame to determine who belongs, who has credibility, who deserves compassion, and whose identity can be reduced then to the worst thing associated with them. So guilt kind of says I did something wrong. Shame says there's something fundamentally wrong with me. And this is where my research comes into play with moral injury, because moral injury kind of asks, what does this event now mean about who I am or who other people are, or whether the moral world can still be, trusted. So you might say that guilt is painful, but guilt can also be morally productive. It can direct our attention towards responsibility and confession and making restitution and change. Shame becomes way more dangerous because it stops evaluating an action and begins totalizing the person. So if I'm shamed, I'm not going to feel empowered to make any changes. The problem is not that we should never feel bad about causing harm. That's not the point, because some moral pain is an appropriate response to moral reality. But the problem is when moral pain becomes an identity sentence, that because I did wrong, I am irredeemably wrong.
Well, thank you very much. You raised two main important points that I want to explore deeper. First of all, you mentioned how shame is not just limited to inside a human being, but it can also be directed outside. When does shame start to shift from external to internal of a human, and actually what factors are affecting?
Ooh, these are good questions. Phil's. Yeah. Okay, you're going to make me think today. This is good. Well, I think shame functions internally when the judgment is kind of absorbed into the self. So just for lack of better terms, I think it shifts externally, I think, when the person can't contain or tolerate or integrate that judgment and begins locating the problem inside of another person or self-references through other people's reactions or perceived judgments towards us. So, or even an institution. I might even say that shame probably originates in our perceived, whether it's accurate or not, awareness or worry or concern about what other people think about us. So that internal kind of shame, that sense that something's wrong with me, sometimes can be a reaction to what we're perceiving in other people. Whether that's actually happening or not is another question. Sometimes we do perceive accurately how people are reacting to us. Sometimes, though, we project onto others and assume they're judging us when they may not be. But that externalized shame, one of the things that happens too externally is if I feel ashamed, I tend to be very judgmental and very kind of harsh with other people. So my ability to say something's wrong with you, or that you are making me feel this way, gets kind of amplified if I'm living from kind of a shame state. So internally, I think shame acts as a form of self-surveillance. We kind of view ourselves through this imagined or actual eyes of another person. So shame can become, or can organize our thoughts. So we might come up with conclusions like, I'm defective, I'm exposed, I no longer belong. People would reject me if they knew the truth. If they really knew me, they would think this way about me. And that internal process, then, the problem with it is it tends to cause people to withdraw or to become silent. Some folks will collapse. What I see in therapy a lot with working with folks who have a high amount of shame and self-condemnation is high self-criticism and high perfectionism and trying to appease everybody. And they ruminate and they worry about things so much. And sometimes they'll even engage in self-punishment or self-harm because of that shame. It's like they're trying to pay for something that they've done wrong. So at its deepest level, I think internal shame is not merely the belief that I did something bad. It becomes a belief that I am bad, I am contaminated, or I'm inferior, or I'm unworthy of relationship. So that starts, like you mentioned earlier in your introduction, that starts to impact our identity. Who am I now that I've done this? I'm not who I thought I was. It affects belonging. Will others still accept me if they knew this about me? And so if I disclose it, I'm worried about losing relationship. If I keep it a secret, I'm not fully present in the connection with other people in groups. And so, because I'm worried about other people, if they really knew me, they probably wouldn't care for me the way that they do. And then, of course, our moral standing gets into that too. Am I still a good person? Am I still trustworthy? Am I still worthy? So that's the internal struggle. When shame shifts to the outside, I think shame commonly moves externally when we experience the shame as too overwhelming and relationally dangerous to kind of hold things internally. So, I can't survive being the bad one, so someone else has to become the bad one. So I tend to project my shame onto other people and find other people to punish out of my own sense of shame. It's less deliberate, I think, than it appears. Externalization, I think, functions as a defense against that internal collapse that comes from our own shame. People who are, just to put it practically, people who are really hard on themselves are also very hard on other people. And that's a practical application of how, if we're coming from a real strong shame-based, we will typically perpetuate that and move that forward externally.
Why did we fundamentally have to construct shame? Does shame have any function of value so far?
Okay, so I think you're asking, can shame have an adaptive function, and why is it so? Why is it everywhere? Why, if we're seeing it in all of human interactions, Is there potentially something adaptive in it, or is there some reason we're engaging in it a lot? Um, yeah, I think shame can have an adaptive function, perhaps, but it's an issue of magnitude. So it becomes harmful when it's excessive and global and chronic. When it gets into things like humiliation, or it's used to control people, I think that's when it becomes uh, damaging. So I think the key distinction is between shame as a social moral signal, perhaps, versus shame as a relational weapon that we use. So if shame is briefly alerting us to things like we've violated an important value, or we've damaged a relationship, or our behavior threatens belonging, or it threatens trust with other people, or that we really need to stop and we need to reflect and we need to focus on change and repair. I think that shame, cold water in the face, can be constructive, perhaps. It's like physical pain, for example, with the body. Um, Physical pain can tell us that the body's injured. Shame can tell us that our moral standing, or our relationships, or our place in the group is being threatened. And so a manageable experience of shame perhaps might sound like, this is not consistent with who I want to be, or it's not consistent with who I need to be. And that can motivate things. The problem with unhealthy shame is that it undercuts and undermines a healthy response to a situation. So if shame is motivating humility, or apology, or restitution, or greater self-awareness, or moral development, I think it could be constructive. The problem is that shame easily becomes globalized. And once I move into that place that because I did something bad, I am bad, I think at that point, it stops promoting repair or growth, and it starts producing hiding, keeping secrets, defensiveness. I've seen it motivate aggression and anger, violence, denial, perfectionism. That's when it starts getting kind of wonky and it starts getting harmful. So it's the shame piece that causes us to begin to hide from reality. That's when it starts getting harmful. So in terms of why humans practice shame, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we are highly relational and social. Survival, I think, historically depended on belonging to a group and feeling the risk or the experience of being rejected or expelled or marked as untrustworthy is dangerous. And so I think shame developed partly as a mechanism for regulating our behavior in relationships and communities. So it's, again, it's an issue of magnitude. If it's constructive, perhaps that can be a good, but I think the way we talk about it today is that guilt tends to motivate conscientiousness, and it's constructive, and it gets us back into the group and begins to have us repair things and to grow up and mature ourselves. But when you get into shame, they usually are talking about it as a form of self-hatred or self-condemnation. And once that takes over, you really can't move forward. You can't grow. It's all about survival at that point. And that's my work with moral injury and trauma cases. Man, the very first thing you have to deal with is the amount of self-hatred that people have for what they've gone through, what they've experienced, how they're taking responsibility for things that aren't theirs to take, or if they are responsible, they tend to collapse in their own self-hatred. So you can't get any forward movement or any healing processes going on. So that self-hatred, that self-contempt might be a better way to say it. That's a part of the shame experience, is what needs to be remedied in order to be able to heal and grow and do all the things that we need to do.
Okay. Dr. Ken, you also mentioned that there is a form of shame that is healthy. As you know, humans are imperfect beings and we make mistakes. Some people even make grievous mistakes that violate human dignity. In such a situation, uh, like let's say a person does such things that are horrible and they cross their moral boundaries, if they feel shame, such kind of shame they might feel maybe before doing such bad thing, fearing maybe the consequences. Is that kind of shame uh, beneficial to the society, or uh, can we use that example to validate shame?
Yeah, I think what we're saying there is we want people to be very sober about what it is that they've done. Um, we get kind of mixed up, I think, because part of what in our own sense of feeling harmed or feeling that an injustice is done, we kind of move beyond justice seeking and we move more towards vengeance seeking. And we tend to want to make people who've done bad things feel the same way we did, or perhaps suffer the way that we suffered, might be a better way to say it. And so we'll talk about justice, we'll talk about accountability, but really what we're seeking out is to cause harm on the other person who harmed us, or harm on the other group who harmed us. And so that's the shame economy that you were talking about, is that tendency to perpetuate cycles of violence and cycles of shame this way. As a survivor, if someone's perpetrated against me, I do want justice, but there's a part of me in my own shame from that wants to make the other person who harmed me to suffer as well. And so that's where we have to differentiate between accountability, which is constructive, versus punishment, which is different. I think if we move towards shaming somebody who's harmed us, we're really undermining the ability for them to take responsibility, because they're going to be more invested in self-preservation than they are going to be invested in repair. I think that's the part we have to remember. All the work that I've done in terms of moral injury work, people who are experiencing trauma, they're kind of sensitized to danger. But the moral injury part of it, we want people to have a conscious reaction to what they've done that's harmed us. That's really what we're looking for. But in our own pain, we tend to want to cause them to suffer the way that we did. So I tend to move into, more naturally and humanly, I tend to move into wanting vengeance, at least initially, before I want justice. And that's the part where we have to be really careful with. So if shame, in an adaptive way, like we talked about earlier, if that helps a person become conscientious of what they've done, and they start to empathize with who they've harmed, and they start to see that what they've done was a bad thing that they did, and it affected people and it affected themselves. If it helps them get in touch with that, then there's hope for restitution, there's hope for growth, there's hope for reconciliation, perhaps even down the road. But if what I'm experiencing is self-hatred or minimization, which is on the other side, I'm never really going to be able to repair or change things, or to grow, or to become less potentially harmful to other people.
Well, when does shame create a feeling that justice has been achieved, while condition that produced the harm remain unchanged?
And this is kind of in an ideal situation, of course, because I personally, just so you know, I believe in consequences to behavior. We don't learn unless we suffer from what we've done wrong. That's good parenting, that's good relationship practices, that's good forensic practice. But the idea that punishment alone will facilitate change in people, that's not backed up in the research. And so punishment by itself is incomplete, because punishment basically asks, what should happen to the person who did wrong. But justice has to also ask, what's the context in which all of that took place? Not to excuse the behavior, but to understand what the story behind the story is. What happened to the person who was harmed, for example? What was taken from them? What truth must be established? What needs to be restored? A person who can be punished sometimes, but while the deeper injuries remain in touch in the person who did the harm and the person who was harmed. So accountability is probably a better way to reframe it, because it involves justice, but a fuller picture of justice that adds to whatever the punishment perspective would have been. So judgment can identify wrongdoing, but it's not going to transform people. So judgment's necessary in many situations, but we need to distinguish right from wrong, and we need to determine responsibility. But judgment becomes inadequate, I think, if it just functions only as a verdict. This was wrong is not enough. It doesn't tell us why it happened. It doesn't tell us who was affected by it. It doesn't tell us what each person is responsible for. It doesn't tell us what repair is needed. It doesn't tell us how to prevent reoccurrence, or whether the person can return to a trustworthy participation in the group. And some folks, I think, and this is a small percentage of people, but some folks we need to protect ourselves from. But the majority of folks who do wrong, which is the rest of us, you and I included, Phils, we need that deeper kind of contextual understanding so that we can be challenged to grow and to change and to learn how to make amends. TV shows, for example, in the United States that involve courtrooms, I've noticed in the last 20 years, you never hear the statement out of a defendant that says, you know what, I was wrong and I need to take responsibility for what I did wrong. A friend of mine who's an attorney says is that the justice system is not about justice anymore. It's about mitigating consequences, and it's about winning. It's not about justice anymore. And so I think morally, I think we need to begin to value that again and bring that back into our groups and our interactions and our relationships again. Judgment can establish moral clarity, but justice requires a moral response to it. So the problem with shaming, like we were talking about earlier, is it obstructs accountability. It communicates not only someone did wrong, but that they're contemptible, they're defective, and they're unworthy of belonging. And that's what produces all the concealment and the hiding and the secrets and the denial and the defensiveness and resentments and scapegoating and all that stuff that you're talking about in your research that you're doing and the work that you're doing. So I think the more completely a person expects to be reduced to their wrongdoing, the less psychologically safe it is for them to admit to what they've done wrong and to begin to address it in a healthy way. So shame makes us preoccupied with protecting ourselves rather than confronting ourselves.
Is it possible actually that accountability exists both at individual and institutional level?
Well, I would say yes, Phil's, only because, I'm a psychotherapist, so people are coming into my office all the time telling their secrets. They're really coming to the end of themselves and they're self-confronting. So I think it's possible. It's very difficult to do in typical social environments, but I think I think some of the work done by Desmond Tutu, the Truth and Reconciliation Project, is a good example of that applied to groups and communities and nations and cultures. But I think some of our cultures are very invested in maintaining secrecy. And I think we've got a long ways to go, but I do think it's very possible. And I've seen some examples of this. So accountability can become, well, in reference to your question earlier, accountability can become unjust if it exceeds a person's actual agency or it ignores the conditions that shape their behavior. We need to not only see the behavior, we need to understand the story behind the story. And when people feel safe enough to be honest, or courageous, morally courageous enough to be honest, those are the folks who actually grow. Those are the folks who change and work on themselves. So, you know, the accountability part you were talking about earlier, sometimes that can exceed what might be just. And it kind of legitimizes people's need to be secret because they're keeping themselves from unfair vengeance or from unfair consequences because the group wants to condemn, they want to judge, they want to shame. And so the secrecy makes sense. But if you have a group who is more invested in truth, but also invested in hope for change and providing opportunities to change and not lightening consequences, but to be more humane and more respectful and more that I'm going to care for you as much as I do the person you victimized, that's really where we're coming from. Again, not to enable or not to give consequences, because I think those are absolutely necessary, but we're doing it in a caring or compassionate way. That begins to challenge that secrecy tendency, so people can be more honest and people can face themselves and become more self-aware and take more responsibility and like that. So it's a little idealistic, I think. There's a lot of hard work involved. If you've read the Truth and Reconciliation Project materials, you know all of the difficulties they experienced and the stuff they went through. And that's a really good example, I think, of a community that's applied these ideas and had a constructive outcome from it.
Well, even when people commit similar acts, they rarely experience the same consequences. Why is shame distributed so unevenly, and who tends to carry the greatest burden of public judgment?
Yeah. And how do we make that, even? So I think fairness is really important here. I'm trying to take this example I have in my head and generalize it out to the broader scope of things. But I see this a lot in organizations that I do consulting for, where you'll have a worker gets in trouble for doing something, and they experience sort of the full force of the policy that are in the organization. So they may be fired, or they may be demoted, or there's some kind of consequence involved. But yet a leader does the same thing and they're not held to the same level of account. So that's an example. And you could translate that into like family systems, of course, organizations, communities, institutions, and look at the experiences of shame and accountability. And you start to see there's the same policies and the same values are in the same groups, but yet they're applied differently depending upon what role or position you're in. And usually what I see is favoritism towards folks who are in more privileged positions or more leadership positions. That has to stop. That has to stop. Matter of fact, when I do consulting for corporations, it's usually for leaders. One of the first things I say to them is, you have to be an example of reconciliation. which means you have to lead in owning your limitations and your faults and your mistakes publicly, in addition to publicly demonstrating the consequences and what reconciliation looks like and what repair and all of that. The leaders need to model this for the folks in the rest of the organization. Same thing with families, parents, fathers. I'll pick on fathers since I am one. If I make a mistake, I need to model how do I address that mistake in order for my kids to follow that lead. So if I make a mistake, I model apologizing, I model taking responsibility, I model consequences, and maintaining a sense of agency and integrity as I'm facing those consequences, and that I'm being adult and mature as I'm taking those things on. So leadership really, I really put a lot of pressure on leaders and folks in the more privileged positions to model what that's like so that the workers and the rest of it can follow that lead. It addresses the hypocrisy that you might be seeing in some of these systems. And so, again, back to the issue of shame, like you talked about from a moral injury perspective, shame is relational before it's internal. And if leaders are hiding and getting away with things, then that means you're hypocritical, which is going to compromise your family or your organization or your culture. And at the same time, if the folks in a lower status or lower socioeconomic status or lower work status, whatever, they're going to be carrying the brunt of consequences, and that's unjust. That's not very fair. So there's other elements to it, but that's usually what I focus on, Phil, is making sure leadership and folks in authority and in privileged positions are modeling all of this.
Wonderful. Why do some people recover while others are permanently defined by one event?
In terms of a shame reaction, perhaps, or a moral injury reaction?
Yeah, let's take an example of the after harm. Why do some individuals are allowed to recover fully, but for some people, actually, it takes years in order to stop being defined by that harm?
Yeah, there's lots of factors in that, and I write about that in my book, Trust Wounds, in terms of the internal and external factors of recovery. You're right. Some people recover from moral injury or shame pretty quickly. Others kind of remain stuck, depending upon what their situation is. And it depends on more than just the severity of the event. I think that's an obvious one. The more severe the event, the more severe the wrong that's done, the more damage that people experience. But it also depends on whether or not people have an opportunity to not be limited by shame, but to where they can actually spend time making sense out of what happened and to begin to distribute responsibility in an accurate way. So to be able to remain in connection and in supportive relationships, and to kind of have more coherence about what they're responsible for versus what others are responsible for, or what circumstances are responsible for. Those are the folks who tend to recover. So people tend to recover when the injury can be integrated into themselves without becoming their whole self. And that requires effort. That doesn't happen naturally. It also requires community, where people can sit with you as you try to pick through all of that and make sense out of it. So people tend not to recover when the event becomes a permanent verdict. And that's what moral injury treatment pretty much is addressing, is it keeps that from happening. So some things that support recovery I've found includes Well, like, for example, the person can name what happened in an accurate way. They're able to get in and kind of move beyond just the shame, and they start to experience other things too, like guilt or like uh, grief or fear or anger, um, and responsibility, rather than just experiencing one undifferentiated feeling of moral contamination. Um, I think another part of it is that we need to be more proportional with our responsibility. You know, can a person sit down and think about what they're really responsible for, and also what belongs to other people or circumstances, and how did all that come about? Were they coerced? Was there limited information they were operating on? Were they experiencing institutional pressure? Or were they in an impossible circumstance where no matter what choice they made, there was going to be something that went wrong? Or these sorts of uh, uh, these sorts of kind of thoughts and thinking that goes into it. This prevents kind of total minimization or trying to exonerate yourself, but it also limits excessive self-condemnation at the same time. They also need a practical path towards what to do. It's amazing to me how many people get better if they're just given a map or a model to follow. That's one of the things I love about the truth and reconciliation work, is it gives you a model, and then people can kind of plug their experience into that model and just start doing those steps. So there's other parts to it too. I think one other big one would probably be that it's important to revise our moral story about the things that we've done or the things we've experienced, because that helps you move from I'm an identity statement like I am not redeemable to something more integrated, like I participated in or I endured something that was morally devastating to me, and I'm responsible for how I live in response to it now. So I'm going to learn from what happened, and I'm going to not repeat it, or I'm going to do something constructive. I'm going to start a podcast, or I'm going to write a book, or I'm going to whatever. That you're doing something constructive or something beneficial is coming out of the struggle that I had, or what I did or didn't do or experienced. The reasons people don't heal from this is, I think, when we leave the event unresolved. If there's no acknowledgement, if there's no apology, if there's no accurate account or no opportunity to repair things, we continue to live inside this unfinished moral reality. And I think the environment then continues to deny or distort the harm. So institutions and families and communities may minimize what happened or reverse blame. Some groups will retaliate or demand silence. And in those conditions, the injury repeatedly renews itself. It stays with the person. Even if they don't act out or do anything, it's still in them and it's still contaminating them. It's very toxic. So there's other parts to this. There's a lot more detail in my book on that if people want to read about it. But basically there's internal reasons and external reasons as to why people don't get better.
Well, Dr. Logan, thank you very much for joining us and helping us to think through these questions with such generosity, depth, and clarity. And thank you very much to everyone who will listen to this conversation. This conversation is a part of Season 2, Dignity in Identity, an ongoing inquiry into how people become recognized, interpreted, and judged within the systems that shape our lives. In our next episode, we will continue to explore with the theme of gender punished and performed, examining how gender expectation become enforced through reward, shame, legitimacy, and social recognition. Until next time, thank you very much.